Hey there, I'm Christopher Schoenwald, and welcome to Life as a show intently focused on helping people find their professional pathway by exploring and unearthing the details of jobs from around the world. As we plow ahead and through the 21st century, it's hard not to recognize all the change taking place around us. I mean, you could consider social, economic, and even cultural transformations occurring. However, the most talked about issue may very well be the environment. Research, data, and experiential anecdotes all point to a world here on Earth that is rapidly deteriorating and will continue to do so until we make drastic changes to the way we live and operate. Initiatives aimed at sustainability, they have begun and are underway. Conversations are being had, companies are instituting new business models, and awareness is being raised. However, even the most optimistic would admit we are far from a point of turning things around just yet. Well, on today's show, we're joined by an individual who, through his company, is intuitively leveraging a naturally occurring resource to upend a traditional and environmentally unfriendly manufacturing process and practice to effect positive change. All right, welcome to the show. So, Ryan Hunt is a scientist and technology entrepreneur commercializing innovative solutions in the fields of material science, biotechnology, and sustainability. And he's also the co-founder and COO of Shloop, a sustainable footwear manufacturing and innovation center in Meridian, Mississippi. With a background in physics and bioengineering from the University of Georgia, he co-founded an enterprise based around converting, and get this, algae grown from environmental restoration into sustainable materials for use in consumer products. And over the past 12 years, Ryan has been enabling brands from all over the world to incorporate algae biomass into their products, which improves the sustainability metrics. And through that process, he intimately learned about the challenges and roadblocks for commercializing and scaling sustainable materials into the real world via global supply chains dominated by countries like China and Vietnam for footwear and most consumer products. And the frustration over wanting to enact sustainably minded change, but being stymied by what he saw as broken supply chains regarding the introduction of new and innovative material, drove Ryan to create an all-new enterprise, one which is focused on reshoring sustainable and innovative manufacturing back to the US so as to enable levers of change to actually be put into action. His own struggles led to realizations that other businesses and individuals were probably facing similar challenges when wanting to build in new, sustainable, circular materials and technologies into their products. Thus, he founded Shloop, a company and footwear factory built on the ideal of enabling sustainable materials and circularity to be effectively integrated into supply chains in a way that brands can not only access it, but also afford it. So with all that stated, Ryan, I mean, it's great to welcome you to the show. How are you doing?
Thank you, Christopher. Fantastic to be here. Looking forward to our discussion.
Yeah, as am I. As am I. Well, I do have the first segment lined up here, and it's something called Coloring Wikipedia. And as my listeners would know, it's a segment where I just kind of read off a definition of the industry or sometimes the actual profession itself of what the guest is involved with. And I do it for a few reasons. One, it brings everybody up to speed on what the world that person lives within is like. And other times too, I mean, Wikipedia is on with the definition, it hits, and other times it's just flat out off. And then finally, I think, we as individuals, we could hold the same titles, but sometimes we just put our own stamp on things. And the way you run your business or the way you operate, it's just going to be different than the way somebody else might have this exact same title. So that vantage point also kind of offers this interesting sort of discussion point. So with all of that in mind, I do have you down here for sustainable business. And I'm going to forewarn you, this is a bit of a wordy definition from Wikipedia. So let me read that out for you. And after that, you can consider, while you're listening, you can consider, all your experiences and we can go from there. Does that sound good?
Sounds good.
All right. So here we go. Sustainable business. A sustainable business or a green business is an enterprise that has minimal negative impact or potentially a positive effect on the global, local environment, community, society, or economy. a business that strives to meet the triple bottom line. They cluster under different groupings, and the whole is sometimes referred to as green capitalism. Often sustainable businesses have progressive environmental and or human rights policies. In general, business is described as green if it matches the following four criteria. One, it incorporates principles of sustainability into each of its business decisions. Two, it supplies environmentally friendly products or services that replaces demand for non-green products and or services. Three, it is greener than traditional competition. And four, it has made an enduring commitment to environmental principles in its business operations. Very wordy, as I said. What do you think? First take.
Well, the most important word in that entire description, in my opinion, is the focus on impact. You look at an enterprise that's a sustainable business, it has an impact. And so what is an impact? How do you measure an impact? An impact on what? And so I think that's really where, for in my experience, what it comes down to is how do you measure and quantify the positive impact, and how do you communicate that to your shareholders, your stakeholders, your customers, your employees, and how do you inspire people by reducing impact? So for me, impact is key. And it's one of the reasons why we like algae so much, is that it is one of the most productive organisms on the planet in terms of turning sunlight into biomass. And through that process, it dramatically reduces the impact on climate change, on water pollution, on ecosystem health. So it can be used in a variety of ways that can improve the ability of a business to produce a lower impact on society.
Yeah. As you well know, you're the second guest I've had on this program with a background in algae. The person, Scott Fulbright, was also on the show. And one of the things that he brought up in that conversation, I thought was really interesting, and I think it speaks to the point that you were just, raising there, is this notion of storytelling, putting it out there in such a way that people can digest it and understand it. And use that information to propel things forward. And I think that's a big, part of it. The metrics certainly play into that, as that word and that notion of impact and what can be done. So I really like that. I think that's a really great insight right out of the gate here. In terms of, back to the definition here, was there anything else that you'd maybe like to add to it perhaps, or
well, I think that in today's age, there's been a massive push by corporate America to focus on what's called ESG, environmental social governance. And so the bigger companies now, I believe, are paying more attention to these green practices. And they've been talking the talk for a while, but now there's like policies and safeguards in place to ensure that they're actually like doing something. It's not just the marketing team saying awesome things about their company or brand, but behind the scenes, there's actually some teeth behind it, like going in and measuring, are they selecting materials that are more environmentally friendly? Are they using more energy efficient manufacturing facilities or office complexes, LED lighting, solar power, all these different ways that you can reduce the impact. But I think one of the challenges that a lot of the companies have is that you can only change what you can control. And for these big companies that are like, for the guys that I work with, these big brands, they have a big impact in their own right? They've got tons of employees. They may have thousands of employees. They've got buildings. They've got HVAC. They've got lighting. They've got commuting and all this stuff that is involved with their business. But that doesn't even include manufacturing. And a lot of times manufacturing is happening through contract services. In fact, the vast majority of it is under contract with third-party factories, typically in China or Vietnam, somewhere in Asia. So those scope 3 emissions, as they're called, are these kind of outside the box emissions for manufacturing, typically aren't directly managed by the brands. So they would love to see improvements in reducing impact, but it's not always their factory. It's maybe it's a Chinese factory, or it's a different companies' operations that they're trying to influence. So that's where it gets challenging, is can you be sustainable? Can a company be sustainable if their entire supply chain isn't sustainable? And this is where I think some of the big challenge comes in, of going back to how do you quantify it? And can you quantify your improvements? Can you quantify your baseline? can you actually reach back and encourage your factory partners to do the right thing and use more renewable energy, or have less scrap, or pay their people a decent fair wage, these types of things.
Yeah. And quite frankly, it's that point right there. I mean, there's so many different things that I'm really excited about this conversation for, but that is one of them. And I know that's going to be coming down the line later on, is that point, because it raises so many interesting, points within itself of, I think this notion of, circularity and sustainability, people are certainly talking about it. Businesses like yourself are being built around it. But we still are at this point where these structural issues are in place, like you said, in manufacturing side, where like things are just out of people's control on those issues. And unfortunately, like that's probably the biggest aspect of the whole business oftentimes, especially if it's a product that's being put out to market, right? If you can do all these other things once the product is completed, maybe how it's delivered, you can kind of build in these policies on that side of things. But if it's being created in China or in Vietnam, in places where maybe they don't have these initiatives put in place or these policies put in place to be more environmentally friendly or, minded, well, yeah, that's definitely not going to be having the impact that we all want to be having. And it's not going to be driving forward, the agenda that we want to be advanced. So it's something I'm really excited to get into in a little bit, but I'm glad you brought that up really early on. It's a nice teaser for a question coming down the line. In terms of, I guess, your business right now, what would be a typical day or week for you right now? I mean, I'm sure you're quite busy with Shloop, and it's still early stages with that company. You've had another one, I know that.
Yeah.
One.
The day to day, well, yeah, it's a lot of travel recently. It's very, very busy, but I would say it's very dynamic. Some weeks there's different priorities. In the past, prior to the work with Shloop, when I was full time at Algix and helping with develop and commercialize these bloom sustainable materials, there my focus is more about working with these global brands that want to make improvements to their supply chain in terms of the types of materials they use and the use of sustainable materials or renewable materials, bio-based materials, recycled materials, all these types of things. And so there it was more like working with the designers that wanted to create something. They're looking for some options for their product. And then it was basically at night working with China and the factories, navigating, okay, which factory are we going to use? What compound do they need? What's their performance specification? What color do they have? How much volume do they have? How are we when are they going to start? Like all these kind of supply chain related questions. So for maybe 5 or 6 years now, I've been very buried in that part of the business. Not so much the fun part of like designing the shoes, but more like, okay, the shoe's designed, the designer wants to use a foam that has a better environmental story or a lower environmental impact with it. How do we actually make that a reality for the brand and can certify it and quantify it and deliver them something that they can market to the consumer in the US or in Europe? So that exposed me to a lot of the challenges that us and other sustainable or innovative technology material companies are having or might have or could have in the future, where it's not so easy to get a new material integrated into a legacy supply chain. The factories there like to buy the materials they've been buying from their vendors that they have relationships with in China. The last thing they want to do is turn over business to some unknown American company that has higher VAT, higher taxes, higher duties, higher shipping rates. It's just for them, it's more cost, and for them, cost is 100% the enemy. So that was the one big challenge that I've seen, and looking at how to solve that, it's not so easy because the entire industry over the course of decades, particularly around sneakers, I mean, it's like China's it, man. I mean, that's where all the expertise is gone. That's where all the development's gone. The government in China has invested big money for a long time, and the local entrepreneurs there have. So, I mean, they have towns built on shoes. So the amount of wealth that's been amassed over the past decades on behalf of the big brands, right? The Nikes, the Adidas, all the big names you've heard of. They're all getting made in the same cities and the same factories that aren't, don't have the logos on them, right? These are independent factories that make all this stuff. So So that was a realization, especially going there and seeing these factories, seeing the scale they operate. It's in some cases, it was probably the most mind-boggling thing was like the sheer number of hands that touch like a pair of shoes. It's a lot.
Really?
And so when we were there, we were kind of thinking about, well, if we're going to make this operation circular, like we've got to start doing some of this in the US again, or closer to the consumer, whether it's Europe, whether it's South America, whether it's US or wherever. We've got to decentralize some of our manufacturing capabilities. How are we going to do that? Can footwear be decentralized? Can you actually make shoes, process shoes, and recycle them in an area close to where they're being consumed at? And so the way China does it currently, I would say it's going to be tough. It's not so easy. There's a lot of moving parts.
No incentive, really, right?
And there's no real incentive to do it. It's just cheap. But when you start looking at circularity, you need to be able to capture that product at the end of its life cycle and bring it back into the factory setting to recycle it. You can't rely on a third-party recycler to do that, and we can't send our trash back to China anymore. So those two issues combined mean that really no brand has a very solid circularity story if they want to turn their products back into shoes. They can maybe turn them into playground mats or running, surfaces or whatnot, but getting them back into a shoe factory is really hard when all the shoe factories are in Asia. This doesn't make economic sense. So, so that was one of the main things I would say that jumps out at me.
Yeah, it's an interesting point too. I mean, for those factories as well, there's no incentive. When I said incentive, I meant incentive for those factories, like you alluded to earlier. No incentive for them really to do it either. That they have their formula down. This is what we do. The volume that they're pumping this stuff out. Why are they going to shift it and change for smaller companies as well? It doesn't make sense. So it's a structural issue that's in place there. It's a big hurdle. It's this big, massive roadblock, and I think that's what makes what you're trying to do all the more compelling. And it's hopefully we're hitting that point now where the public awareness of these issues is shifting and changing, that these types of things are amounting to demand from a consumer. Like, no, I want to know how this product that I'm going to be purchasing is being made, for one, and then two, how it's going to be driven back into the system, and hopefully we're getting there. And hopefully within this conversation to kind of get a better sort of pulse on all of that, because I'm sure you know a lot more about that than certainly myself and probably a lot of listeners too. So
and just to answer your question about the day of my average life today, it's been less about working with the factories in Asia, more about, okay, how can we reshore this and do it manufacturing in a way that we can actually pull it off in the US. And so that's we've been working with new technologies, new materials, training up new staff, trying to find people who still have the art and skills of like handcrafted sewing and stitching and, woodwork or, working with their hands. So, we're really trying to bring back a new supply chain.
And sorry, that's where Shloop comes into all of this. Is that
and
correct?
that's Shloop, yeah. So the Shloop factory is a sustainable innovation and manufacturing company where we're building our first facility here in Mississippi, same hometown as Balloon Materials or Algix. And we're taking those materials now, instead of shipping it all to China, we're trying to source it along with other types of sustainable materials like vegan leathers, recycled fabrics, different recycled rubbers and foams, et cetera, and actually pull those all together to make finished goods here, as opposed to having to ship it all to Asia and then receive it back as a finished good.
Awesome. Yeah. That's such a compelling story. Yeah, I love it. In terms of, I guess, maybe shifting into a new segment here, we can continue on this back and forth, but this first segment here, our second segment, is a Q&A discovery. And maybe you could rewind a little bit here just to gain some added perspective on all of this. Now, I know, of course, in what you're doing right now, a lot of entrepreneurship, a lot of business work, but I understand your early beginnings were within science, a completely different realm, obviously, and I'd like to know how you sort of transitioned from that world into the world of business. Like, was it a moment there? Was there some formative experience? Was there someone in your family perhaps involved in business, or, a gentle nudging from someone? I'd love to hear a little bit more about that.
Yeah. Well, yeah, so I'm a pretty hardcore scientist. I'm a physicist and bioengineer. Got degrees in both from University of Georgia, and just been fascinated with science my whole life. Particularly, kind of nature-inspired technology. Biology and physics always fascinated me, all the way down to the quantum level. But I've also, my father was an entrepreneur, so I've always kind of had this itch to just do my own thing and try to develop and innovate new ideas and bring them into the world. So I would find it insanely boring to like just have a day job where I'm just a cog in a wheel of a big machine. I really want to create new things that haven't existed yet and that solve major problems for humanity. And I think about these problems and these technologies really on that kind of first fundamental principles, applying physics, math, fundamental understanding of a problem, and looking at it from that regard. And I think that's kind of where the business side comes from. At the end of the day, it's all those numbers and spreadsheets and math. So there's a lot of carryover between basics of physics, basics of engineering, basics of business models, and then pulling all together into something that's like, all right, this is compelling enough that we can actually create a marketing story around it.
Okay. Was there any particular aspect that when you did transition from science into entrepreneurship and into business that you kind of had to skill up on a little bit? That was a bit of a tougher transition for you?
I mean, still, 12 years later, it happens every day. There's always new things to learn that you didn't know how to do. I mean, so I was the case where it was like I was in grad school doing a bunch of research, wasn't exactly sure how it was going to all play out, but it was, looking at algae-based biofuels in like 2007, 2008, 2009. And so I could have been hired by a tech startup out of Silicon Valley. That's probably was the most likely scenario for me. But I just, when it came down to it, I needed to do things the way that I felt they needed to be done. So I did, when I finally realized where I think the opportunity was, it didn't align with any of the companies in the space that I was aware of. So it was like, all right, if this algae material play is going to work, nobody else is doing this, let's do it ourselves. And so I joined forces with a partner, a co-founder of Algix named Mike Van Drunen. He's also an engineer, but was also a business guy, had been in business for 20 plus years and had that business, experience and could raise the funds. And, he was a little bit older than me, so he had more credibility when we go talk to early investors. So we kind of had the perfect pairing of like, I was the scientist, he was the business guy. We're working together to solve this common problem.
Yeah. And from an investor's perspective, that's perfect, right? You've kind of got both sides covered there. You can kind of trust.
And you have to, So if anybody's out there thinking about starting a business, if you're a scientist, you need to find a business person. If you're a business person, you need to find a scientist.
Yeah.
I really think they pair well together because everybody kind of keeps everybody accountable, right?
Yeah. Totally. Okay. In terms of the whole study of algae, I mean, initially, when you were in school, I'm guessing this started in university, perhaps, maybe sooner, I guess, I don't know. But where did that come from? Was it something that was just put on your plate? Like, I think when I was speaking with Scott, and he'd mentioned how he grew up in Michigan and he was interested in marine biology, but he's in the middle of Michigan. I mean, the oceans aren't exactly all that close. So what do you do? What do you do? Well, it was algae blooms is what he studied, when you're there close to the Great Lakes like that. So, in terms of you, like what brought you into the world of algae in the first place?
So mine's a funny story. It was direct experience. I started creating my own algae blooms on accident. Okay. So in college, I got really into saltwater aquariums. I had 5 reef tanks in my college apartment.
Oh, wow.
And had a bunch of different creatures and different ones, had lionfish and eels and all this kind of stuff. Well, the common denominator was when you feed these organisms, these animals, these creatures, you get nutrients, an abundance of nutrients in the water. And if you don't filter and clean the water over time, it gets so challenging and you end up with accumulation of nitrogen basically in your water. And so I was just battling these algae blooms in my fish tanks for like months and months, years. It went on for a long time. And and you could do a major clean out. Like I'd go in, I'd clean the water, I'd scrub the rocks, I'd suck all the algae, I'd skim it out with nets. I mean, it's been hours trying to clean these fish tanks. And then a day or two later, it was like I wasn't even there.
Back at,
So that started to get like, well, wait a second, this stuff grows so fast. I can clean it all out in like a day. It's back. Like there's something's got to be here, right? So I did a little bit of research on the internet. It's like 2005, 2006. I think I was Googling, maybe it was Yahooing. I don't know. It wasn't AOL News. I know it wasn't that, right? But it was going in, and I found that federal government of the U.S. had published almost 25 years worth of research that they did on the aquatic species program. It was like a 300-page report from like the mid 90s, and it was decades of government level led research on turning algae into biofuels. So this report had an enormous amount of information in it, and it basically laid out a great case to where we can harvest biomass from algae at a rate that's way faster than any plant. It grows faster than trees. It grows faster than, corn, than wheat, like all these other plants. Doesn't even compare. Like it's not even the same order of magnitude. It's like 10 times faster, 100 times faster than trees. That growth rate was like, all right, that's clearly, if we're ever going to run the planet off of something that's not fossil fuel based, then this has got to be it. And I did even more research and found that it was like, oh, well, duh. The fossil fuels, the petroleum that we suck out of the ground is actually ancient algae blooms. So the whole planet for the past 150, 200 years has already been kind of powered by ancient algae blooms. And we're just digging them up. Like, then why couldn't we just use algae blooms from today?
Right.
To power the world. So that to me was like, all right, this is totally doable. It's just a matter of technology, scale, and investment is really the path. So not that that's an easy path, but like those things are doable.
Yeah. I love that story for a couple of different reasons. Like one, it just, if you get your eyes open, first of all, in recognizing these things and starting to think a little bit critically, it's funny. It's funny how an experience like that can just shift and change your entire life, the trajectory of your entire life. Like you've got a life built on this now, right? Business is built on this, and it all sort of
my whole life is around this idea. My entire life is based on this idea of algae, basically. Yeah.
And it started just kind of working with your own tanks at home and being annoyed by it. Most people just be annoyed by it all and maybe just give up, like, screw this. Like, I'm just getting rid of it all.
Many people have. Many people have.
Yeah, right. And a little bit of thought has just shifted.
I'm done with it.
Yeah. No, that's a great story. Yeah, thanks for sharing that. I guess, there's so many different areas to go into, I suppose, and you've already spoken to this point already, but if we could, I would like to maybe dive back into it. I know we're kind of jumping all over the place right now, but this notion of the present, where you're at right now, and recognizing again these manufacturing issues, these roadblocks is what I kind of led off with, off the top. Maybe you could speak to that point just a little bit more, if you could, in terms of, how you're going about things right now to kind of avoid all of that, or to give options for companies that don't want to plug into those traditional systems or traditional supply chains.
Well, the system's really tough right now because, we also started a small little shoe brand a couple of years ago just to see what it would be like to go through the process from the other end, right? We were selling pellets to these factories. What's it like being a shoe or footwear brand trying to make a shoe and use the material? So turns out it's really hard. The system is really like the tables are slanted in a way that benefit the really big brands. Makes sense, right? Like for them, if you're a huge brand that has a big brand name, a factory in Asia is going to want your business. They are going to give you favorable terms. They're going to finance molds for you, that you might be able to avoid outlaying tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars.
It's the volume.
That is the initial investment required just to get the tooling to make the sole of the shoe. That's really the crux of it comes down to like, how are you going to build the base of the shoe, like the sole of the shoe, and the capital cost to build the molds can be tens of thousands of dollars, and typically you have lots of different sizes and widths and different versions of it. So you could easily spend hundreds of thousands of dollars before you even made the first pair.
Shoe. Wow.
Maybe make the first sole, right? Like, so, and now granted, you don't do it like that. You go in through and you typically make, 2 or 3 or 4 molds. You might spend $10,000 or $20,000 up front in a sample size to make sure that this is the style you want to go with.
But this is just for one shoe, right? Like one.
That's just for one. That's just one shoe of one size. So imagine, okay, now you spend 20 grand. You got a sample, like one shoe that you go and show people. Are they going to want to buy it? Hopefully. If they do, then you got to go back and you got to wait another 2 months. And typically these cycles are 18 months to 24-month cycles to go from like an idea, a product creation, all the way to actually manufacturing it in China. But then you got to go back and spend 8 times that much on new molds. So that's really the challenge, is the barrier to entry is quite high unless you're
Yeah.
already an established footwear brand or you have a lot of cash.
Yeah.
And so for the new designers, the new innovators, people it's like, it's either really hard to do and you got to like go to China and work some magic, and maybe you can get a sample made for free by a friend if you know somebody. Like that's kind of the only way you can really get in the system. Or you guys got to be, or you got to pay for it. You got the money to do it. So, so for us, I think that's been one of the big elements of like the realization is that if we can lower the barrier to entry, one of the key parts are these is the tooling. And so our innovative process Shloop has been, let's flip the script on that. Let's look at a way to reduce or potentially eliminate all tooling costs. And so that's what we've been focused on, is looking at technologies that take steel tooling and instead use different types of molding processes, not injection molding, not compression molding, but using 3D printed tooling and kind of clever ways of replicating the tool with at lower temperature, and making a very low cost prepare it from the beginning. So whether you're doing, for us, it's probably a couple pennies per mold, but you pay that whether that's one shoe or whether that's 1 million shoes.
Wow. So just completely attempting to disrupt the industry by
attempting to disrupt it. So normally we look at it, it's like, well, I got to spend $100,000 to make one shoe, or I got to spend $100,000 to make a million shoes. But if I amortize over the million shoes, then it's not such a big number. It's back to the penny level, but you got to have $100,000 up front to do it.
Yeah. Okay. I gotcha. What drew you to, I guess, this whole aspect of shoes in particular? Like what was it?
That's a good one. Was not the trajectory. We were trying to make flower pots and mulch films and agricultural things that we thought algae would be good in from like a scientific perspective. But then again, why you need the science and the business, we quickly realized that, those commodities aren't the right thing to go after first. I mean, maybe eventually we can get there. But what we identified was that in order to have pull from the customer, in order for the customer to really want your product, you need to offer them something that they need. And, a maker of a flower pot doesn't really get any benefit from putting some algae in it, really. I mean, it may be something there, but it's marginal. A big footwear brand that bases their entire business on marketing and their brand and their sustainability objectives, those types of companies are going to be much more interested in investing in companies or materials or technologies that would help them promote or improve their product. So we probably in 2016, we made a pretty major pivot as a company at Algix. We said, all right, we're going to stop focusing on these commodity things. While they may work, while they may be interesting, while they may make sense, no one really wants to pay for it. We got to focus on corporate brands that are maybe even publicly traded, because the publicly traded brands are under even higher scrutiny to do sustainability and ESG and all those elements that are good for us. And they're big. They want to talk about these kind of things. That'll help us get our name out. We can get our word out of what we're trying to do. So that was probably the main thing that we realized.
And also the other thing I love about it too, I mean, is a byproduct perhaps of it all, is that, I mean, it's a scale issue as well. I mean, who doesn't have footwear, right? I think obviously we all do. And it's something there too that that offers impact, right? At the end of the day, that offers impact if you can advance this thing forward, that's where you can really start to make or see some differences, see some change taking place.
The other cool thing too. The other cool thing has been like when we were at so earlier in the journey, we were doing biofuels, right? So you go to a conference, imagine trying to show everybody what your biofuel is like. You got some pictures, maybe. You can't drive around, you can't fly with gallons of diesel fuel in your bag. Like you wouldn't want to, nobody wants to see diesel fuel, So, but all of a sudden, when you start making shoes, you have a consumer product. Not only can you actually transport it, but it's functional, it's cool, it's stylish. You're combining art, science, storytelling, material. I mean, it's like all these totally. That's what we like about the new Shloop factory, is that it's more than just like a sneaker factory. This is not really just a sneaker factory. This is like a state-of-the-art innovation center where we're providing both an opportunity for brands to come and understand how they can incorporate and where they can incorporate these different sustainable materials into their products, see those products being made, educate the consumer on these products, maybe even invite the consumer in to even buy directly. We may eventually even be able to sell directly to the public. That's certainly in our kind of longer term strategy. But when we have all this in one place, it's like we've got a lot of automation, robotics, sustainable materials, sustainability, life cycle assessment, design, art and design. So you're kind of combining all these things into one creative hub that you never know what's going to come out. You might find some really amazing things might be developed here that you wouldn't necessarily be able to conjure that up or to get to that level of pushing the boundary if you're just like working with a contract factory in China.
Right. So much possibility. I think that's the word that I kind of keyed in on there. No, I love it. Yeah, I think it's really exciting what you're doing, and again, offers so much promise in so many different areas. So yeah, super exciting. Maybe this might be a nice sort of point to transition into a new segment here as well, Ryan. Something called a water cooler story, and you've already shared a bit of a story already, but I'm wondering if you've got something else for us today.
I would say we talked about the major stories, I think, are like the epiphanies of mass manufacturing in Asia, where like all of our products come out of China. And when you go and try to look at, or I shouldn't say all, not everything, but there's just so much production that's happened in China. And then going to China, especially in footwear, you look at the wealth that's been amassed in Asia. Yeah. And you come back home, I live in Mississippi, and I used to feel like I was coming back to like a third world country, like being in Shanghai or being in Hong Kong or Shenzhen or Dongguan or whatever. Mm-hmm. Like if you haven't like been to Asia or been to China or some of these places, like it's hard to really fathom the scale. And then coming back home to a 40,000 person little rural town, it's just like it's so interesting. Enough, So we've been trying to find a way to pull back some manufacturing and look at ways that we can do it in a way that actually is scalable. And so I would say that that's been our biggest challenge is really developing a process and identifying the right team that can pull all this together and get the right people in. The community, though, here has been really supportive. It's been really interesting. As word's kind of gotten out into what we're doing, we've been getting lots of serendipitous connections, people who could interestingly fit into what we're doing or have interest in what we're doing or can support us or help us in an area that we might. So like, for instance, we've had people reach out about knitting programmers. We've had people reach out about different, I guess, shoe collaborations, maybe the best way to put it, potential customers, I guess, reaching out. As the more we've talked to people, when I say people, like other companies, other brand, other footwear people in the footwear industry, pretty much everybody we've talked to wants to work with us, right? Like everybody's all about this idea of like, let's build some shoes a little bit closer to home and do them in a way that's more environmentally friendly and measure and evaluate how we can improve the process. And so that has been really exciting, seeing the homegrown support that we've been able to get. And I think if we can prove this system that if it can work here in Mississippi, I feel like we can replicate this in other parts of the country. Maybe it's not going to work in LA or in some really, really high, expensive areas. I can work in Boston, but the South is becoming a big manufacturing area. A lot of the automotive companies are setting up massive factories here, like tire companies, et cetera. So from a manufacturing front, I think we're in a good position, but there, I think, is also opportunities to take this technological model. Once we automate it we're not going to be able to automate everything. Like there's still going to need to be people that are able to touch and feel fabric. I mean, it's just inevitable. There's going to be some of that. We can try to minimize it as much as possible, but the more we minimize it, the more universal we can make it, the more that we can plug this thing other places. And so for me, I guess the epiphany was that this is doable. It's like there's a decently high chance of success here. I wasn't so sure when we started Algix that there was going to be like the chance of success at Algix was probably pretty low, right? Like we're going to disrupt plastics with algae seems kind of far-fetched. But 12 years later, we now have 130 brands using algae in their products. So like it's getting there. It's not there 100%, but like we're heading the right direction. We just need to tip that scale into mass adoption. How do we convince these brands to not put us in 1% of the products, but put us in 10%? That's like that's a totally different level than where we're at right now. We're at the kind of the 1% level. And so the goal of Shloop is to say, hey, we can put it in at 1%, or we can get a little tiny bit of penetration in Asia due to all these issues. It's hard to get a lot of penetration there. But if we can do it ourselves and we can control it and we can minimize the cost and streamline the process, then I think we can generate a lot larger positive benefit or a lot lower impact if we can control the entire process. And so the materials that go into a product make up about 30% of the environmental impact, but the manufacturing process can make up like 60%. So I've been spending the past 12 years focused on like the 30% fraction, like what you make a product out of is a huge factor.
Yeah.
But also how you make that product is a huge factor.
Big one.
So we were kind of addressing the what, but not the how. And with Shloop now, we've got the what, where you're bringing in all the sustainable materials, and we're looking at how do we dramatically improve how we make the product to lower the impact.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, you have the experience and the expertise on one side for sure with those 12 years, and then starting to develop it on this other end. And yeah, that certainly does. I can see where that optimism would be coming from. You've enough conversations with people getting on board, being interested, wanting to be part of this, and coupling all of that sort of together. Yeah, there's certainly opportunities there. At least it would seem. Yeah, so that's certainly encouraging news from an outsider's perspective as well. So I love that. And this might be a nice transition point into the last segment here, a crystal ball segment. As the name implies, we're usually looking towards the future, trends, predictions, so on and so forth. Now, you raise an interesting point just in that last segment there. You're talking about how brands themselves, are fine with putting, 1% of, say, some of their efforts into sustainability, perhaps, or materials into their products, but getting it up to that 10% level it's a game changer, right? I'd love to know where we're at on that in terms of are we getting closer to that tipping point of brands going all in on this, or are we still a little bit off on this? Maybe a little bit more insight on that.
Yeah, this is a great question. I do have some insight on this, and this would all be public information, nothing confidential or proprietary that I'm sharing here today. But a lot of the big brands, look at Adidas or Adidas, look at Wolverine Group, look at Caleres Group, look at Nike. They have put out some pretty strong targets in terms of a minimum amount of recycled content in their products in the range of 2025 to 2030. They all fall in that kind of, probably next 5 to 10 year windows. Now, whether it's convenient, whether they're going to be able to achieve these goals, kind of what remains to be seen. But I would say that there's kind of two camps. There's I won't say they're camps because they're not mutually exclusive. But one would be trying to maximize the recycled content of a shoe. So using things like recycled polyester, recycled yarns, recycled nylon, recycled foam, or recycled rubbers, any sort of post-consumer or post-industrial feedstock that you're able to reuse and reprocess. The problem with recycled is that there's a limit. You can typically get a pretty high level, but as you go higher and as you recycle it more, the properties degrade. And a brand doesn't want to deliver a sub prime product. So you got to have a good product. You got to be able to meet the specs. So there's a limit to how much recycled content you can do. But typically the brands that we're seeing are I would say minimums maybe 20%. Your average is probably 50%. And some of the brands are trying to go 100%, which I don't know if they'll be able to do that, but that's kind of the goal. Yeah. So I would say the recycled content goals are pretty strong in the market right now. The demand for the recycled raw materials is very high. And the pricing is actually high because the collection of all the recycled goods isn't mature enough to really support this relatively rapid transition to this. I mean, it's only been in the past maybe 5 years that all these brands have made these commitments and shifted their production into it. So the supply chain hasn't fully caught up with the demand yet, the supply for the demand. And then the other kind of side of it is the bio-based, the natural. So instead of using recycled product, can we use a plant-based product or a natural material that's not derived from a petroleum or a fossil fuel? And so that one is, I would say, almost a little bit tougher because you are ultimately either doing one of two things. You're either going through a complicated fermentation process where you're taking plants, kind of feeding it into a biotechnology system where you're fermenting extracting things from bacteria and
complications.
Perfect example,
Lots of
like
complications.
ethanol.
Yeah.
You're basically building a massive, fermentation vessel, and you're going to make beer or something like that, or vodka or whatever, and you're using that ethanol as now a raw material in a chemical process. So there's people that take ethanol and turn it into polyethylene, like plastic. Like that's a whole massive industrial chemical refinery that you have to build to do that. Right. So not cheap to set up, but they've done it in Brazil. It services the world at the moment. For some of these bio-based polyethylenes and EVA foams and stuff like that. There's also the idea of using the biomass as a natural filler, or there's cork. Like there's different materials that you can either use a natural material like cork, or you can try to refine that material into something that's the same or very similar to a petroleum-based chemical. Okay. And so the more you refine it, the better the performance is, and the more like plug and play it is into the supply chain. But it's also more expensive. It's actually got a lower environmental impact now. You start raising a bunch of questions. Well, is it really better to do it that way? I think corn ethanol in the U.S. Corn ethanol kind of was a bit of a conundrum, because on the one hand it was a bio-based product, on the other hand the impact of making it wasn't actually all that great because all that went into it. So you have to do those life cycle assessments to really figure out, is it worth it? And so I think that's a big challenge with the biomaterials, but I think they're going to get there. And the advantage of the biomaterials is, as you're working on new chemistries, not trying to match old chemistry, but using bacteria, for instance, to produce its own types of biopolymers like PHA or PHB or some of these other ones, PBS. You're able to produce a biodegradable, bio-based polymer that actually has really good properties, or could have theoretically good properties. So, but it's expensive. Because it's small scale at the moment. So these are the battles that basically between all of them, the recycling is the lowest risk and like the most achievable. So most of the brands have gone with that. So for us,
simplest
it's like,
to understand too.
We can get it's easy to understand. And when they surveyed the customers, they looked at like the marketplace and they did public surveys. They said, out of these 5 words: sustainable, recycled, eco-friendly, circular, like what does the consumer resonate with? And number 1 was recycled. Everybody understood what recycled means. No one quite understands what circular or sustainable really means. And sustainable is vague, or it's just all encompassing. It's not a clearly defined term. Circular is a similar term, although I think it means a little bit something slightly different in terms of like being able to take a product and clear, I think, kind of recycle it as well. It's they're all so because the jargon isn't defined. That's been okay. Well, recycle is the easy thing to do. Let's go with that.
Yeah, got it. That's some really interesting insight, and I think that's stuff that I myself certainly would not have known until you kind of shared a lot of that there, and I'm sure listeners as well will really enjoy that sort of deeper level insight into it all. So I guess here's the final question. I mean, in terms of all of this, like, how optimistic are you that we're going to be seeing major transformations in the next 5 years, 7 years on all of this stuff? Is it coming down the pipeline that quickly, or based on some of those challenges you just put forth, that we should be a little bit more patient?
No, I think it's happening. I think COVID in many ways has dramatically accelerated the time frame here, because it's illustrated or demonstrated the risks of doing everything in one place. And I think also there was a documentary that came out where the year the world stood still, where it's like, oh yeah, by the way, if humans didn't operate as much, by the way, the planet would actually makes a dramatic improvement, right? So they were able to kind of show, hey, all of a sudden we stopped commercial air flights for X period of days, and reading about cleared up, right? So it's like, okay, humans have an impact to the planet. That's pretty clear now. We got to do something about it. I'd say the only really hesitation is, anytime you go into these booms and busts, the clean tech's always a tough one, right? And it hasn't survived a lot of the hard times very well, because it tends to be low scale and expensive. And times of like right now, oil prices are high, right? Oil prices go up, investment in alternative energy goes up, and then fast forward, the thing that happened to us was in 2014, the fracking boom happened. In 2006, 2007, gas was expensive. There was tons of research money flowing into algae. I was part of that. I was getting funded for research. We started the company on it. there was a lot of enthusiasm about algae and technology. And then 2014, gas prices dropped to like $40 a barrel. And then all of a sudden, like nobody cares about
funding dried
sustainability
up.
all of a sudden.
Yeah.
And all the funding went away. The programs got closed out. I mean, literally, like the place I used to work at, like it all evaporated, and the whole thing fell apart. That was the same reason. Remember when we opened this story was about the aquatic species program. The aquatic species program started in the 1970s, and it was under the Carter administration. And so they were looking at it. The National Renewable Energy Laboratory was doing this research on algae and solar panels and all this stuff. It went on for like almost 25 years. Well, it got canned, and like right after the first Iraq war with Desert Storm, we got free, basically really cheap oil out of Iraq. The price of oil goes super low, as has been in years. And then boom, all the funding dried up from all the algae research. They put a bow on it. They published the final report, and
that was that.
And it didn't resurface until 2007. So it took 13 years later for it to come back. So my hope is that whatever, weird fluctuations in the global market that's happening over the next 1 to 5 years, that we don't have a major global recession. But I think the ESG is so far along now that there's going to be probably some clawback here and there, but the companies that have made these commitments are going to continue to try to follow through with their public statements, I hope. And I think, again, going back to what we're doing at Shloop, it was like we see the problem. It's not that like the companies don't want to do it. It's that it's not so easy to do it when everything that you do is based on these external factors. And so if we can truly find a way to decentralize and reshore a more sustainable manufacturing model that it implements things like artificial intelligence, automation, robotics, green chemistry. Like we're doing a lot of really interesting green chemistry. Our factory is less of a industrial petrochemical injection molding factory like you might find in a car factory or in China. Instead, we're actually building ours like a food science facility. Ours is like a massive bakery, a big kitchen, and we're using all water-based chemistries. And we're instead of using massive amounts of heat and pressure and chemical reactivity, we're using time and like drying. Basically, our parts cure overnight versus us having to crank out more parts every second in this injection molder. So it's a very different philosophy. But the way that we're setting the factory up is quite clever because we can actually outproduce the same amount of parts compared to a traditional machine. In our machine, even though it's a totally different designs, a totally different concepts, totally different chemistry, but we're doing it in like a much simpler, cheaper way that's actually faster.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, it's some clever thinking, obviously. I think I use the word intuitive, in terms of your business, the way to describe that. And I think that perfectly sort of encapsulates that sort of feeling right there and an approach to everything that you're doing right now. And also, too, I guess one last point here I'd like to add as well, that kind of gives me hope, at least when I have these conversations, with people like yourself who are involved, embedded within this sustainability driven movement, circularity, regenerative approaches, is I think like what makes it unique right now is that like outside of the businesses and all the opportunities of leveraging technology being there and, the opportunities that presents is also like just this notion that like the general public, I think, and younger generations that are coming through are just getting more demanding on these points. Like they're the ones that are like hitting up some of these brands on social media and saying, hey, they're going to call them out if they're not hitting, certain targets, or if they're not producing the right type of products, because people are going to search it out, that they're going to find like, what's the impact of this or that? Sometimes it's misguided, sometimes it's spot on, but either way, it's keeping brands on their toes. And then ultimately, for those companies themselves, like the stakeholders as well, like they have pressure there as well. They put the pressure on the brands as well to succeed, because some of these other companies, they're starting to shift and change their ways. And that has an effect on the whole company's trajectory ultimately too. So, I mean, that for me, at least personally, sort of gives me hope on all of this. And that coupled with, the conversations that we had today, it's been, it's really enlightening conversation. And I can't thank you enough for all your insights and stories and everything you've shared today, Ryan. It's been really, really special. So thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you so much. Appreciate that.
Yeah. Well, for those interested in learning more about Ryan and his company, of course, you can find him through his website, Shloop, and also Algix. And two, you can find him on LinkedIn. Hit him up there. And if you like today's show, of course, share. I mean, in light of the conversation we're having today, I think these types of conversations in terms of sustainability and whatnot, they need to be propelled forward. More people need to hear about this stuff. It's only going to serve the interests of all of our needs moving forward. So share, share, share. And two, you can head on over to YouTube. We did launch a channel over there within the last year, which hosts the video conversations. And the cool thing there is we will have some imagery associated with the actual talk, so you can kind of take it in a different manner. And also you can rate, review, and subscribe wherever you access your podcasts. And hey, that stuff does help way more than you can know. So please, if you have a few moments, I would love to read what you think of the show. How are we doing? And then finally, please don't forget to tune into the next episode of Life as where we'll continue to explore and unearth the details of professions and the people behind them. I'm your host, Christopher Schoenwald. Until next time, stay curious about life and living.